Hey guys, this is Brian Huffman from Brian Huffman Photography, and today I'm going to be reviewing the Canon EFS 60mm f2.8 macro lens. The first thing that I want to talk about is who I think this lens is for. So this is one of Canon's lenses that has the EFS distinction, which means that it can only be mounted to their crop sensor bodies like the Canon T series, the Canon 70 and 80D series, and the Canon 7D series. So if you ever plan on upgrading to a full-frame camera, you might want to look into other options like the Canon 100mm f2.8 macro lens or the Canon 100mm f2.8L macro lens with image stabilization. While those are both more expensive options than this, you might end up being better off in the long run if you plan to upgrade to full frame, because you might end up buying twice. The next thing that I want to talk about with this lens is build quality and some of the features that it has. While it feels very plasticky on the exterior, it's similar to a lot of Canon's L lenses like the 24-70 f2.8 and the 50 and 85mm f1.2L lenses. It has a very plasticky exterior, but it feels very tightly constructed overall. It has a metal rear lens mount, which is an upgrade from any of the kit lenses that you might have with your crop sensor bodies. It has full-time manual focus override when it's switched into autofocus. It has a fairly long 135mm focus throw, which is nice for macro photography where you're often going to be using manual focus. It also feels very nicely dampened and smooth when focusing. It has a 52mm front filter thread, which is nice if you're going to be buying filters for this lens because they will be relatively cheap. It has a fast and smooth USM autofocus motor, which is also very quiet and tracks subjects well, even moving subjects. So I've brought up a few photos here to give you an overview of the image quality of this lens. This orchid cactus here was shot at f7.1, and if we zoom in here into the area that's in focus, you can see that there's a lot of detail here at 1:1, and it turns out a very nice overall result. This portrait was shot at f2.8, and you can see that it's very sharp here on his eye, and we have a very smooth fall off from the area that's in focus to the background. This was also shot at f2.8, and again we can see a nice smooth fall off to the background, and you can see just how smooth the bokeh is there when you're shooting close up like this. It's another close-up shot where you can really see how much it can fall away being able to focus this closely to your subject, and how accurate the autofocus system is. We're very sharp here on the eye at 1:1. Here's another portrait that gives us a good example of how circular the bokeh is in the background. This was also shot at f2.8. We have a nice sharp result here on the eyes, and it just falls away nicely in the background. Here again, we're stopped down to f4 here, and we're starting to see a little bit of the aperture blades coming in here, but overall it's a very circular result still, and it is very pleasing bokeh overall. We have maybe a little bit of a hard edge on the outside of some of these highlighted areas here, but overall pretty nice. Maybe a little bit of green chromatic aberration here coming in on some of these parts over here in these highlighted areas, but overall a very nice result. So here I have a couple more commercial photographs of watches to show you. This one was shot at f16 here, and if we zoom in all the way to 2:1, you can see that in this area of focus there's loads of detail here, and it just falls off nice and smoothly towards the out of focus region. The second one here was also shot at f16, and when we zoom in here you can see we have a very, very sharp result overall. And the background, again, very pleasing, and it turns out a very nice image quality overall. So there's one more thing I want to talk about here, and that is the DxO mark ratings for the 60mm macro lens and the 200mm macro lenses. So what I've done here is I've mounted them all to the 70D since this is a crop sensor lens, and I've brought them all up here. So if you look at the 60mm macro lens here, we have a sharpness rating of 11 perceptual megapixels on the 70D. And if we go up to the 100mm macro, we can see that there's not much of a difference here. We're only getting 1 extra perceptual megapixel by moving up to the 100mm macro. So if price is a large consideration for you and you don't plan on upgrading to full frame, you might want to consider that. The one advantage that the 100mm macro has over the 60mm macro is it has a focus limiting switch where you can switch it to focus only in closer regions or throughout the whole range. And thirdly here, the 100mm f2.8 L lens gets a rating of 13 perceptual megapixels on the Canon 70D. So in upgrading to the L lens, you're not seeing much of a difference on a crop sensor body, but if you plan to upgrade in the future, one of these other options might be a good choice for you. So if we take this and we mount both of these to the 5DSR, we can see here that the 100mm f2.8 macro lens gets a rating of 21 perceptual megapixels, while the L lens gets a rating of 24 perceptual megapixels. So we're not seeing much of a difference here still between these two lenses on the 5DSR. So if you're concerned about price and you're planning on upgrading to full frame, I think that probably the best value macro lens would be the 100mm f2.8 macro lens over the L lens. So one more thing to consider here when you're trying to decide between these two lenses is the minimum focusing distance. So if we look here at the longer lenses, we're going to have a farther away minimum focusing distance of 1 foot for both of the L lens and the 100mm f2.8 macro lens. And that's going to be important in things like photographing insects and things like that that might get scared away by what you're doing. Whereas here the 60mm macro has a minimum focusing distance of 7.8 inches, so you have to be that much closer to get a true one-to-one macro shot. So you kind of want to be thinking about these things as you're deciding what lens is right for you. And also if you're going to be doing studio work in a limited space on a crop sensor camera, you might want to be thinking about what types of photography you're going to be doing with the lens and whether or not 100mm might be a bit too long for you, and if the 60mm would be a better option for your personal type of photography. One more thing to be considering is that the shorter minimum focusing distance, if you ever want to use extension tubes to get even closer to one-to-one, you're going to have to be focusing very, very close to your subject. So that's another thing that you might want to think about with working distance, is if you're going to want to get beyond the 1-to-1 ratio, you might think about getting the longer lenses. So I just want to recap what we've gone over with this lens. If you plan to upgrade to full frame in the future, you might want to consider other options because you don't want to end up wanting to buy twice to get a full frame version macro lens. The build quality is very nice overall, and it's a very versatile lens. It can be used for macro photography and portraiture and anything that you might want to use this focal length for. It has excellent image quality. I've had my personal copy for over 2 years and I've been very happy with the quality of the results. Thanks for watching.